We have with us Dr. Ella Striem-Amit, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Georgetown, where she directs the Sensory and Motor Plasticity Lab. And there she focuses on the neural processing of action in individuals who have experienced early sensory and motor deprivation. She was a postdoctoral fellow with Alfonso Karamazza, who many of us know, and she got her bachelor's and master's from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I just want to say that Ella has had very extensive media coverage for her interesting work on the balance between inherited brain organization and experience-dependent plasticity. And the title of today's talk is Perception and Action Without Hands. So welcome. We're glad to be here finally, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the generous introduction. I don't need to tell you about how vastly hands are important in our daily lives and how large a representation we have having to do with hand both perceptual and action representations in the brain. On the perceptual side, we have a representation, a dominant representation for hand perception when we are talking about perceiving different parts of our body. We are obviously engaging large portions of our brains when we are actively perceiving other people's actions, and that is also organized to some degree in a somatotopical manner. And of course, within the action system, most of the daily actions we perform are performed with our hands. And we have both a large representation, somatotopic representations of the hand in terms of sensory, motor, low-level control, as well as more broad representations of different action and movement execution. And that makes the population that I study of people born without hands even more interesting, because these guys were born bilaterally without hands, and yet they perform every single everyday action that we do, completely done using their feet. They draw, they write, they text, they drive, they fly airplanes, they type, they lead complete lives, performing all the same actions that we perform with our hands, performing them with their feet. And the question is, how does their brain compensate for that? How does the brain networks that are supposed to be engaged in hand perception and action, capable of making that transition and perform the same actions with their feet, or even perceive hands, translating them to foot representations? So, sorry about that. So that allows us to address questions such as the role of motor experience for hand-related brain functions, right? To what degree do we rely on motor experience, motor simulation in order to perceive actions in others? And to what extent is the organization limited by those sensory motor low-level features? In other words, when we perform actions by the hands, are those brain regions representing the fine motor control of specific to the structure of the hand, or does it have to do with broader principles that can be then translated across moving body parts or effectors? I study a very tiny sample of individuals, and I'm very happy to talk about that aspect of my work because I am very selective in working with people born bilaterally without arms, without hands, who have no phantoms, and hand phantoms are a very rare phenomenon and misunderstood or debated phenomenon in people born without hands. And they are all right-footed. So they perform the same actions. They have tool and everyday life compensatory use of their feet. And we have to tailor all our analyses and all the questions we want to ask to account for the fact that we work with small samples. And that's something that's generally a broad principle in what I do. I study people born blind, a little bit of deafness and mostly people born without hands, which allow us to ask those questions about our representations and the potential and extent of plasticity, knowing full well that it limits us methodologically in some ways. Before I go into the specific studies, I want to acknowledge the contribution of many, many people to the works I'm presenting today. Some of the first half of the work I'll present is work that I did working with Alfonso Caramazza at Harvard University in my postdoc, working with Jill Van Ooscore and Moritz Worm. And some of the current work is done by multiple people in my lab in collaboration with Eris Freud from York University and with Jody Cullen from Western. Specifically, I'll be presenting works today done mostly by Yuqi Liu, who's now a faculty member in the Chinese National Academy of Sciences, James, who I, for the life of me, still cannot pronounce his last name, and I apologize for that in advance, and Sriparna Sen, who is now applying for clinical psych grad schools. If anyone wants a brilliant student, let me know and I'll convey that information to her. So I'll walk you through a little bit today, running through the perception side of things and focusing more on the action side of things, about how all these different systems operate in the absence of hands. And when we start with looking at perception, we know that in the extrastriate body area, in the lateral occipitotemporal cortex, which is shown here in a kind of twisted orientation over the inflated cortex, there is a selectivity and an organization based on different body parts with a huge representation for the hands. And we know that this is not just a visual representation, because people activate that same selectively, that same body part when they move the hands in the scanner, even without seeing them. So this is a visual motor representation. And we also know that in a portion of that, there is an overlap of representation for the tools and the hands, which is kind of surprising in the visual cortex, because body parts and objects, or more broadly living and non-living percepts, are typically separated in the brain. So this overlap is non-trivial in that way. Moreover, this overlapping region represents the degree to which the tool extends the body, and there's been some really nice representational similarity works in that regard. So our question was, to what degree does this actually require having hands or operating with hands on tools? And may I remind you that, of course, our participants have completely normal tool interactions. However, they do not do that with their hands. Despite that, we were able to find that overlapping activation in a vast majority of our individuals born without hands. And you can see the individual peaks of those foci in yellow for the individuals born without hands. And I refer to them as IDs, in short, individuals with dysplasia here. And I'll probably give them confusing names throughout my talk, and I apologize for that in advance. It's about in the same part of the brain. You can see that it's a bit more posterior, but that's not significantly different. It has the same overlap. It has a similar functional connectivity to the rest of their brain. And more importantly, it has a similar pattern structure of relating and preferring hands over feet and tools over large non-manipulable objects. Now you can, we also show that it's not activated when moving their feet. So it's not some sort of a foot imagery. It's not about phantoms. Overall, it just looks like this area develops regardless of experience in moving and using tools with hands. Now, you may say that this is completely trivial, and I would to some degree agree with you, because in a way, it makes a lot of sense, and that the wiring and the development of these structures would be hardwired in our brains, because this has been a long-lasting association that makes sense to be imprinted and hardwired evolutionarily. Humans and human ancestry have been using tools for long enough that this makes sense for this to overlap. And that is generally a gist that I will keep coming back to in my talk, about how a lot of the brain wiring and structure develops prenatally And therefore, it makes sense for a lot of this to precede the onset of motor experience and of experience in general. Now, that doesn't mean that motor experience does not affect representation. Of course, we can dig into differences in how individuals born without hands represent objects and tools that they can or cannot use. And this is work in the pipeline that I will not dive too much into. But the idea was to try and see what is it that makes an object a tool, and look into the representations of tool regions for tools that people can see and know everything there is to know about them, but can't motorically interact with and use in a similar way. And we worked with a subsample of these individuals, because for the majority, so again, I have studied these 5 individuals born completely without hands, 2 of which answered that they could use all the objects in my sample, or leaving only something like 2 with their feet. And when you look at some of these objects, like chainsaws, it raises some interesting questions, but it meant that this study was done on only 3 individuals, whereas the other 2 are complete superhumans. That said, we could decode whether these individuals had used or had not used tools in a large area of the tool use network. And these areas were, we could differentiate between the dysplasic, between the, oh, this is not written correctly. And we could differentiate in these regions between the individuals used without hands and controls, but also between the individuals used without hands who have not used these tools and the individuals without hands who have used them. So this is not about the absence of hands or the use of these tools with feet. It is about motor experience in manipulating and using those tools for their typical functions. We've also had an experiment looking at action observation, where the question has a lot to do with how crucial is simulation or motor simulation for our observation and understanding of other people's actions. I'm sorry if I'm rushing through any of this. Feel free to stop me for questions, by the way. But the idea is that there are interesting theories linking our ability to comprehend other people's actions through a simulation model in which one necessarily activates motor representations of those same actions in order to comprehend them. And these embodied cognition accounts would, in a way, predict that individuals born without hands would have differences or limitations in perceiving hand actions performed by others. So the question was, to what extent is the hand action observation network limited by their inability to simulate those same actions with their own body? This is a work that was primarily done by Gilles Vanuscore and Moritz Worm, where we looked at the action observation network, and we were able to decode the type of hand action performed, whether it was opening or closing, trash bin or a trash bin or a door, in video clips well controlled and cross-validated across visual parameters. And we could decode that for hand actions in individuals born without hands, suggesting that these nodes do not rely on low-level motor parameters. Interestingly enough, in these regions, we were also able to decode foot actions in controls and to cross-decode, suggesting that these nodes generally are not limited by the motor effector, even in controls. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions on this part before I move on? Because I know I've been kind of running. Okay. So
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. You said that that they can't, even people who can't simulate the actions are showing activation of the action observation network. And so you are assuming that because they're dysplasic, they cannot simulate actions with a missing hand. But did you directly test that? I'm curious.
So we did some things like asking them whether they can imagine a hand. I also have a motor imagery experiment now running about looking at what it looks like when they imagine moving it. So the question is essentially whether motor simulation would require like simulating with a hand, or whether it would require simulating the same action with a different body part. Is that your question?
Well, I was actually asking whether you knew that they couldn't simulate the movement of their missing dysplasic limb. Even, right, because that's a very different, I mean, that in itself is a complex, you know, kind of it's at the heart of what do you need in order to be able to simulate something? Do you need to be able to have done it with that body part yourself? Or can you still imagine it even with a missing body part? So I was just, you stated it very strongly that they can't simulate with using it with their hand. I just was curious as to whether you'd actually tested that. That's all.
It's a great question. I am testing it. I have this really oddball experiment where I'm asking them to imagine moving their feet, which they do have, their hands, which they don't have, and their tail. Where that would be a good control for a mentalizing network in the controls as well. And I don't have the results of this experiment, but I have tested their ability to, so I've asked them, and when I tell them to imagine these things, they're like, so how, right? And I really have to stress out that I'm imagining movement and not imagining vision. I do get measures of, I'm taking measures of motor imagery as well. Of course, I have too small a sample to make any meaning out of individual differences. But generally, they don't have a phantom. We have asked them about that. And it is non-trivial for them to understand what it is that I'm asking of them when I tell them to imagine moving their hands.
Thanks.
I have analyzed the data of one participant so far, and she's activating very different parts of her brain when we're asking her to imagine moving her hand as opposed to imagine moving her foot. But it's just one participant, and I still don't have the control data set. So it's a question I would really, really be interested in seeing what the outcomes are.
Thank you.
Now, with regard to action perception, you can come out and say, okay, so yes, I'm showing that it's less sensitive to the output effector and experience, and it's not limited by motor simulation. If you take my point already that they cannot simulate, but you can say, well, these are visual areas, so of course they would be independent of all those motor parameters. The thing that got me into asking that question to begin with, though, is that they're not purely visual either. And multiple studies in people born blind, including one study of my own in the past, show that these regions, the same areas of the association, visual cortex, and the ventral and dorsal stream, are activated for the same types of body parts, tools, hands, actions in people born blind. So it's not purely visual either. And now we see that it's also independent of the acting effector. And that's kind of what brought me to ask these questions to begin with. In the blind, we see that we have a preference for the same type of computation, whether it's body parts in the extrastriate body area, reading in the visual waveform area, or even the ventral dorsal dissociation, showing that the representations in these areas transcend visual features. And now it tells us that these representations are more abstract. They're abstracted beyond both the modality of input and the experience and the output effector and experience. So I'm kind of taking this to mean that These are abstract representations beyond those sensory motor features on both accounts of input and output. Now, what goes on in action, right? In action, it's harder to say, oh, it could be just a visual representation. What happens when they actually execute movements? Okay. And what we're trying to do right now is really look into this question of whether there is computational selectivity for different action types in people born without hands. Trying to kind of say, what's the core organizational principle here? Are these areas that engage in motor execution for the hand, where there's a subspecification for different action types, or the other way around? Are these areas organized by the motor tasks like reaching and grasping and writing and bringing something to your mouth, or does it have to do with the body parts? So essentially trying to ask if those association motor regions abstract across effectors. And we're trying to do this in both behavioral approach, trying to test in what ways are foot actions like hand actions, and also, of course, what are the neural substrates that allow them to support handless action execution. So in looking if foot grasps are like hand grasps, mute this, we have typically developed participants for now, and we'll also collect individuals born without hands performing foot and hand actions, collaborating with Erez Freud in learning how to collect detailed kinematic information from the hand and feet as people perform these actions. And looking into multiple aspects of these actions, like the trajectory, the velocity profiles, the grasp aperture. I have a feeling I don't need to preach the choir and tell you that these parameters have very clear characteristics in hand actions. And we're kind of testing whether the same, it's already out, whether the same parameters characterize foot actions. And we have recently shown that the kinematics of foot reaching is similar to that of the hand in terms of the acceleration portion of the action. And there are differences exclusively after the deceleration phase, after the ballistic movement onset. So it looks like parts of the kinematics that are controlled by the motor plan seem to be consistent across these effectors, and there are fine-tunings having to do with the motor control. And we're now training individuals born with hands to perform foot actions to see if experience can modulate those differences. And we also show that much like when hands grasp objects and they pre-shape the aperture, increase the aperture of the fingers to larger objects, even before contact with the objects, showing that this has to do with the motor plan. There is a trend, a significant effect of the maximum grip aperture. How far apart are the fingers when the foot grasps objects? So even though there are, of course, vast differences between the hand and foot aperture, and a lot of that has to do with how wide the toes can get, because over here with the large objects, we're almost reaching the ceiling of how far those toes can be. There is that similar trend suggesting that the foot can also pre-shape and plan those object interactions in terms of the action.
Can I ask a question here?
Please do.
Hi. So how fast are these movements?
So you're absolutely right that there is a difference in the velocity after the acceleration, the max velocity. So the feet and hands are actually approximately as fast at getting to the max velocity, and then the foot meaningfully slows down. And when we look at not percent of movement time, but just movement time, this is still consistent, and this is vastly slowed for the foot. And again, part of the reason we want to test people after some training is to parse out whether that has to do with, it's a larger body part, it's bigger muscles, it's heavier. We're way less trained in performing these actions. It's harder for us to do that because we're not as well trained. And again, we hope to get that data from the individuals born without hands to compare that, because they're extremely well trained, and then we'll be able to see whether it's just a matter of experience or whether it's a matter of biomechanical limitations in that aspect.
It could also be, yes, or it could also be the error margin, right? So if I'm, I have a lot of scaling with my hands, but with my foot, if the scaling is relatively smaller, I mean, the range is relatively smaller, there is a smaller safety margin when sort of grasping the objects, if you will. So that might have them rely more on feedback processes as they decelerate.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And we also note that individuals have a hard time maintaining an aperture with their foot. So it's not just about control, it's about if they open it too early, they slightly close it a bit and reopen it. So it's complicated to measure. And I really hope that the individuals with dysplasia will be able to address some of those things. Because they also have slightly more flexible feet in that regard. Yeah, there are a lot of different questions, and we have a lot of data and a lot of ways to mine it, and we're scratching the surface.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So may I ask you also,
please.
May I ask also for the maximum, so you were saying that the maximum grip aperture is similar, so the pattern is similar. What about the time to maximum grip aperture? So in line with, does it occur similarly or not across the different shape size?
So I'm embarrassed to say that I don't remember this right now. I would have been slightly more prepared probably in 2 days when I thought I was giving this talk, but I don't remember this off the top of my head, and I'll have to get back to you. You can also check out the paper. It's already out in Experimental Brain Research. But honestly, like, my intuition is that I think it should be later, and I'm not sure whether the data supports that. Like, we would have thought initially that similar control would mean that it would arrive at a similar time, but I think there's something going on there where they need more control and feedback in performing this, and I'm not sure whether the timing is the same or not. I don't want to commit, I'm sorry. Okay, and then we went on to try these same actions in the scanner and try to see whether the neural correlates of these actions overlap as well. And we had a first experiment in which we did this very simplistic design of reaching and grasping actions, which we know are separated in the brain in terms of their mechanisms between the ventral and dorsal motor pathways, both the parietal and the frontal cortex. And we had individuals lie in the scanner and perform these actions either with their feet or with their hands. Controls performed it with their hands, individual with the dysplasia with the foot. The controls also performed it with the foot actions, but I'm not present with their feet, but I'm not presenting it here. And this was a very simplistic 2x2 design. And although, of course, we see a main effect of effector, so we see a difference depending on whether it is a dysplasic individual performing the action with their foot or a typically handed individual performing the action with their hands. And we see them, of course, in the primary sensory motor cortex, but also in the superior frontal sulcus. There are still multiple areas that don't seem to care. They show the same difference between reaching and grasping, primarily with a preference for reaching when individuals, typically developed individuals, reach with their hands, and when people born without hands reach with their feet. And it's both cortical and subcortical. We have effects in the basal ganglia, in the cerebellum. And it shows that some of the association motor system seems to be organized for the action types, and not just the body part. What I really liked about these results, honestly, is that we can really track this abstraction gradient in the motor system between areas that care about what body part is performing the actions, and further away from the primary motor cortex, both in the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex, areas that care about the action type. And it's a really clear gradient if we plot the F value for those main effects. From an anterior to posterior gradient, we have two peaks of a preference for the action type and a preference for the effector. Importantly, we can also decode the action type in these hand selective, action selective regions defined from the literature and from the controls in the individuals born without hands, as well as, by the way, in the primary sensory motor hand and foot area. And we don't really know what to make of that, honestly. That is more consistent with findings from Tamar Makin's group, showing information about actions performed by individuals born without hands or amputees from the sensory motor hand region. What we are hoping that this kind of work could eventually lead to is the decoding of action types to drive brain-machine interfaces and the guidance of prosthesis in a more abstract, based on a more abstract representation than the fine-tuned motor features. Now, again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I don't need to tell you that it makes sense for us to have an action gradient, and there are multiple other works, including your own, having to do with different levels of abstraction and different action types and different representations of actions in the parietal lobe and the frontal cortex. And all this line of works is trying to show is that some of these areas have this action type based representation that is effector independent. It does not care what body part performs the action. And that brings us to the question of what is going on in the primary sensory motor cortex, right? And we really tried, we came into this kind of dual mind. We didn't know which alternative we'd find in the data. Whether the hand selective M1 would still be topographic, early motor cortex, where the representation is expected to be low level, tuned to the fine motor features, and therefore we could predict it would be overtaken by close by body parts, much like what happens in late onset amputation in animal works. Or whether it would reorganize to the body parts used as a hand, which is the kind of prediction that Tamar Makin's group is making. And honestly, I came to this under the assumption that it would be the latter. That I explicitly had two different foot actions, low level ones, and I was hoping to be able to decode that in the primary motor cortex of people born without hands. And if it is the latter of reorganization based on the body part used as a hand, then we have an extraordinarily clear prediction. Because they really only use one body part to compensate for those actions. It is not the same as what happens in congenital one-handers who use a variety of different body parts to compensate. It's not the same as what happens in amputees as well. They really use just their feet in order to compensate. And much like previous research, we have seen activation in their primary sensory motor hand region when they move their feet. We had a very simplistic design in which it was a block design. They had flexing and adducting actions for their feet and for their hands, as well as movement for other body parts like their shoulder, their abdomen, What was it? And their lips, of course. And we looked at the somatotopic preferential mapping and controls, which of course looked completely normal. We used that to localize the hand area and to see what takes over the hand area, outlined in white here, in individuals born without hands. And what we found was kind of astonishing to us. We really saw that this area is nearly completely overtaken, and this was consistent across hemispheres. It was consistent across individuals, and we show all these maps in the paper, that this area was overtaken by the closest body parts, by the shoulder, and to a lesser degree by the abdomen, and not by the body part that they use every day of their lives in order to interact with their environment. Now, we do have an extended representation or response to their feet, and outside of primary regions, we do have a selectivity for their feet where hand representations, where hand responses are supposed to be, but not in M1. And you can see that for these individuals, where we plot the beta responses for the controls and the individuals born without hands. And what's interesting to see is that, of course, this kind of reorganization is based on the connectivity and the wiring and what goes on in the typically developed brain, right? The other body part that activates this area in controls, not just the hands, is also significantly the right shoulder. So there are overlapping activation patterns, even in controls, and this is what allows this area to overtake the primary sensory motor cortex in people born without hands. What it showed us is that this hierarchical gradient of abstraction does not really get as far as M1, right? M1 doesn't care what body part you use as a hand. It cares about topographical constraints. It is specific and it is tied to the sensory motor specifics as opposed to those higher level representations and higher level areas. So right now, what we're trying to do is complement these preliminary findings with more actions, both ethological actions that have ancestral evolutionary meaning, as well as new actions like writing, which we can perform across the hand and foot. I mean, we've all had that experience of writing with our toes in the sand. And there's been ample behavioral literature showing that we can translate actions across effectors. And we want to see whether other aspects of the action network is organized across effectors, even as far as brain regions, as body parts that are very dissimilar from the hand, very far in the homunculus and so forth. We're also looking into action observation by asking individuals born without hands to imitate actions across effectors and having controls, observing hand actions and performing foot actions and vice versa. And of course, looking more deeply into this hierarchical organization, both in the cortical and subcortical loops and networks, as well as parsing action components, not just whole action types, but looking into whether things like the grasp angle or width can be extended across effectors. And we just presented preliminary results from that at CNS yesterday, where we show that we can cross-decode parameters about the grasp action across effectors in typically developed individuals, and we're still analyzing the data from individuals born without hands. And we're still not integrating this line of work with visual motor reference frames. We have a lot of different angles to advance with this research line. I'd be very curious to hear what other ideas you can offer. Now, another completely unrelated side of research that I do in my lab has to do with blindness and individual differences in cortex plasticity and in sight restoration, which I hope will eventually be able to integrate with this line of research. But of course, right now with a small sample size I can't look in individuals born without hands into individual differences. We can only reveal patterns that are extremely consistent across them. I don't know why I have 2 slides of this. My apologies. Again, I hope to be better prepared a couple of days from now, but overall, I hope I've convinced you that at least some of the perceptual action computations can develop without explicit motor experience in simulation. That some of the action execution computations develop for the existing effectors. And because we also show that in individuals typically born with hands and feet who can, show these same patterns across body parts, we really think that this is the reason for this invariant. These representations are simply abstracted from the sensory motor features. It's not a reorganization as much as a utilization of the same networks for what you simply have. We do believe that these are based, and I haven't emphasized it in the data I presented here, but every such study that I have also has functional connectivity overlapping findings showing that these really can develop based on the typical existing connectivity patterns that develop a lot before the onset of motor experience. And to our surprise, the topographic early cortices showed a different organizational principle. We are able to decode parameters about the motor actions in M1, but it does not seem to have a univariate main effect, and we don't know how to integrate those 2 findings. Honestly, the way I think about it is that these regions are topographic but receive information, because in fMRI we can't dissociate those 2. They receive information from higher level stations, and we're now trying to look into more fine-tuned temporal information, even in the fMRI signal, to try and parse these explanations apart. And again, hoping that in the future, probably many years down the line, we'd be able to better understand the action system in a way that would allow us to use those higher level abstract representations in order to guide prosthesis, augmenting what is currently mostly being used, which is muscle pattern readouts. And hopefully that would increase the ease of control and ease of use and well, more broad use of prosthesis. I'll shamelessly advocate that we're looking for people in the lab if you're interested in this line of research. And thank everyone again for their contributions for this work. And thank you so much for your attention and for your patience as I was late for this lecture. Thank you. I'd be very, very happy to hear your perspectives and questions.
Wonderful. Could I lead out? Thank you very much. That was a terrific talk. Dylan Edwards here. If your main motivation is for the BCI ultimately to kind of control prostheses, I'm trying to understand what a take-home message might be from what we know thus far from your work. So, considering that the developmental brain is different than the mature nervous system that gets damaged, but both are of interest in the BCI world. So the deafferented adult nervous system, like an internal capsule lesion or a spinal cord injury. But what I'm trying to consider is this idea about where you might think this control of actions is housed at a fairly rudimentary level. And I think that as I've tried to grapple with this for brain mapping, we learned that an amputee or a spinal cord injury, you have an invasion of this area that's deafferented. But in earlier discussions I had with the BCI folk, Lee Hochberger, Brown and colleagues, whereabouts do you place these arrays for control? They tell me they go directly to the hand area. So they're even in an area that's been deafferented for a while. So I'm curious, I know that's different than the developing brain. So where might be a logical target, would you think, based on what you know?
So that's a really broad question that I keep going back and forth from and to. So of course, in a fully developed brain that has been lesioned outside of M1, you can still read a lot of information from M1. Personally, my experience with overtake, and that's consistent across the literature, especially from Tamar Makin's group, is that these areas are not necessarily meaningfully overtaken as much as they are overtaken in terms of the, so the question is whether the information content is being overtaken or whether the activation, sensitivity, and excitability change to allow less relevant inputs to drive it, and whether the signal for hand action is still there. Am I close to addressing that question? And when we think about the developing brain, so my gist with this has less to do with the implications of necessarily early onset deprivation and more along the lines of maybe it makes sense to put arrays or hopefully less invasively EEG caps in association sensory motor cortices and drive a lot of the prosthesis use based on higher level action type preferences that are more trivial for us to activate than the fine motor control. Because when we think about bringing something to ourselves, we do not actively, consciously control things like the aperture of the fingers. It is way easier for us to, we have more conscious action planning at the level of the higher representation of the action type and the objects we want to engage with and the part of space we want to engage with. And kind of where I'm taking this question is whether we can understand the abstract action goals enough to be able to drive some of that information from that level as opposed to, or in accord with, in addition to, implanting things in M1. And I don't know enough about how the association motor representations are yet to know whether that is feasible. So I'm very much at the low-level basic research stage of this, which is also why I'm doing this with fMRI and not EEG, which we will also need to obviously add in order to do things like action planning. We are separating action planning from action execution so that we can look at those components separately, but really my thinking of this is extraordinarily basic at this level.
Thank you. I was wondering if I can maybe follow up on that a little bit. So I was curious, you talked about these sort of higher level abstract representations. And I guess I was wondering what exactly you think those are. Like, is it something about representing maybe the goal or something like kinematic trajectories or something else? Like, what is this thing that's being represented up there?
So that's a great question, and honestly not one I have a full answer to. So the reason I'm looking at ethological versus new types of action is to try and get at the same types of actions that show selectivity in primates, in long trains of stimulation, and whether we have specific representations for those actions. I think a middle-level representation would have to do with the trajectory and those middle-level features. And we are actively engaging with those as well. So that's why we have these subparameters of the grasp. We are recording from accelerometers as people perform these actions with their feet and their hands so that we can use representational similarity analysis to parse out where in the motor system we have representations for trajectory, for speed of movement, for the principal components of these actions, because we know this has to do with synergies and not just specific parameters that I would necessarily know how to conceptualize. We really are trying to look into those questions actively, but I don't have an answer yet.
I just want to say something about abstraction is tricky, of course, and it's easy to say that things are abstract, and I think very important to define the features over which abstraction occurs. So in the motor system, you know, sort of at the level of premotor cortex, it may be the case that things like trajectories and kinematics are the important features, where what you were talking about earlier in your talk, when you were talking about lateral occipital temporal cortex, there the units of abstraction are likely to be quite different. And we know from some studies of action semantics, for example, some of which you cited in the fMRI literature, but we have a lot of behavioral evidence as well, that things like whether or not the elbow is fixed, or whether the movement is big or small with respect to the head, whether it's respect to the body, whether it's, you know, things are clumped in very different ways in that part of the brain. So that's just my comment. I'm sorry, but I also had a question too, Ella, which was about, I wanted to make sure I understood in your last slide where you were summarizing your findings from a lot of talks. You talked about in primary motor cortex, the organizing principle is likely to be somatotopy. And so that makes sense of, as we well know, right? And that makes sense of why things like the shoulder invades the arm and hand cortex, right? It's proximal. But then there's also a line in there that I didn't understand about hierarchical abstraction in the primary motor and sensory cortex.
No,
Okay, good.
I'm sorry if I was not clear. I don't think that M1 is abstracted beyond body parts. I think
Thanks. Okay.
I see information about across effectors being decoded there, but I know that with fMRI, this could originate from other areas. So I'm actively trying to parse those two, because I know that it is not consistent with what we know from.
What was hierarchical though? You mentioned that quickly.
Yeah, you're right. I skimmed through this, and I in my last slides, I was actually trying to make it, it's some of my slides, I was trying to make it clear that I'm really talking about abstraction across body parts. And of course, it looks different from between visual areas and motor areas. And we're trying to target those levels of abstraction. My thinking of it, and it may be simplistic because I'm more of a clumper than a splitter, is that when we engage in action planning, we would have this cascading hierarchy where we consciously plan something that's a way higher level action goal. And that would have to be translated across the motor hierarchy into something that can be translated into a motor command. And what are those levels of hierarchical abstractions is something that I don't fully know yet. And there's obviously a lot of information from behavioral works, from your group and from others, and some fMRI supportive information. But of course, the behavioral work and the lesion studies is what drives our causal understanding of those networks. The advantage of fMRI here has to do with the size it allows us to parse, right? Because strokes tend to be larger, and it's even with beautiful voxel-based, I'm blanking on the term right now, and it's embarrassing, but mapping of where the lesion-based mapping, it's harder to get at smaller elements, which fMRI can give us. And I hope that that would allow us to reveal what are the gradients of abstraction. And that's why we have this painfully long experimental design in which we have control participants lie for 8 hours in the scanner, not at the same time. And we get multiple actions and multiple behavioral features, and we hope to be able to parse it out slowly with representational similarity analyses.
Thank you.
And I have no doubt that it doesn't begin to address the question. As far as I'm concerned, this is a new avenue to me, and I'm very excited to see what will pop out.
Great.
Right.
Yeah.
Mon, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I really appreciate the talk. That was nice data, and thank Thank you for that. I was just a bit surprised about the size of the shoulder representation of in those patients.
Size of the what? Sorry.
The size of the shoulder representation in those patients.
Yeah.
Surprised by the size that it takes in the brain, and I was just wondering if the fact that, yeah, because maybe I might be wrong, but in my mind, we have like in neurotypical participants, there is like the end representation is quite big because there are a lot of tactile information to integrate, yeah, coming from the end. And I'm just wondering if the fact that the shoulder representation is big in those patients means that they are really good to perceive the tactile information at the level of the shoulder. Yeah, so I'm curious about that.
It's a great question. Not one that I've addressed yet, but it's a great question. My intuition, and that's honestly based more on my experience in studying blindness, is that they, even though their primary compensatory body part is the foot, they are more sensitive in that area. And I know that because I've been stimulating them in the scanner and they're ticklish, and it was a problem to find a place I could touch their shoulder in the scanner with a brush from afar without tickling them, which did not happen in controls. But I know it's big, it's surprising. I don't think all of that is functional recruitment. I don't think all of that is being used to represent better information from the shoulder, right? Like the shoulder, I mean, what we know from the representation of the Braille reading finger in congenitally blind people, and they do learn to read Braille later in life, but they do touch things way more to represent the world around them, is that it is more, they have better acuity, but not like insanely better acuity. And the correlation to that is not blindness, it's how much Braille they read. So my thinking is, and that tells me a lot about like the distribution of the receptors in that region, which probably does not increase significantly. And I would doubt I would find something very similar in their shoulders. I think some of that is epiphenomenal, and I still really don't know what M1 does, what it computes, and whether it has a functional role in these people. And that's why I'm so confused about the conjunction of univariate preferential response for the shoulder and adjacent body parts, and the fact that we can decode information from that region about foot actions, even in controls. So I feel like I would like to understand this, but right now I only have. Sorry. And my video is apparently frozen in a weird way. Okay. You have another question?
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, no, I think probably wrap up.
Shailesh, go ahead.
Go ahead,
All right.
Shailesh.
So really nice presentation.
We'll wrap up.
The global thing that I'm wondering about is, yes, in the somatosensory or the sensory motor cortex, you see this sort of, I would call it more hardwired representation that is between adjacent areas rather than functionally driven. And in those other areas where it is sort of more effector independent, so you see representation for higher level abstract action. What do you think is the signal for development of that representation? Is it something that is hardwired, or is it something that they develop based on how they see people move? Or so what is the signal for developing those effector independent representations?
That's a great question. Again, my thinking is kind of that these regions are hardwired in a lot of ways, and they're hardwired. I believe that they're hardwired, and I know it's it's such a loaded term, right? I think that the anatomical connectivity of those regions broadly develops prenatally, again, prior to the onset of most of the experiences that we have. And there is fine tuning based on our experience, right? These regions, they are association cortices, they develop way later in stages in development. So they definitely are, affected by experience. But the broad, large wires develop prenatally. And I think that's kind of what allows these representations to form intactly, right? Because if you have large wires that are hardly innate, and I use this term carefully, and they partly overlap, and then there's pruning, right? The original overlapping representations and wires allow you to prune functionally. And that's what I think happens also in the visual cortex of the brain, where the deprivation is so much more profound, right? And yet we see in a lot of these association visual cortices responses that have conform to the same tasks regardless of modalities. So I really think it's kind of a scaffolding paradigm in which the brain hardwired connectivity pattern, anatomical connectivity pattern, drives the functional development, and all that is has been slowly developing and fine-tuned through evolution. And that's really why I focus a lot on ethological actions, where it makes sense to have typical action types or patterns, and I intentionally don't venture too far into goals. That makes sense to have these hardwired connectivity patterns based on lower level features and based on other systems interacting to drive the same goals. Does that answer the question, or is that like?
Yes. These are quite interesting things to think about.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And we hope that we can interact more in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Thank you.